Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We're so pleased and so excited to bring you tonight's program on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre with Professor Karlos Hill. I want to thank everybody at the Eastside Freedom Library for co-sponsoring tonight's program. We've been working with Peter, with Carlo, and with Clarence for 3 or 4 years now. I'm sort of losing track, but we so appreciate this partnership in order to make these programs possible. This program will be recorded and it'll be available on both the RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channel within a few days, and it's live on Facebook right now. So some technical reminders for those of you on Zoom: please keep your microphones and personal cameras off, and please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time. We'll have questions at the end of the program. And after the program, we'll turn off the recording and you may turn on your microphones and cameras so we can all talk together. Please consider supporting both the Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Historical Society. Both organizations rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining. RCHS has a wonderful quarterly magazine. You get admission to Gibbs Farm, which is now open this summer, so we're very excited about that. And the Eastside Freedom Library also has wonderful benefits, which are on both of our websites. And they are on the screen, rchs.com and eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. This Thursday, we're going to have a program with Tom Schroeder of Waldman's Brewery talking about his reconstruction of an very old historic saloon into the current Waldman's Brewery. So check out our website on that. We'd like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota, Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, which includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota, Makoche. RCHS is committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we are so pleased to bring you tonight's program. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe at the Eastside Freedom Library. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for coming. It's been great working with the Ramsey County Historical Society on these monthly History Revealed programs. Next month, we will be learning about the Mapping Prejudice Project on July 8. This month marks 7 years that the Eastside Freedom Library has been in operation. Despite the challenges, we have had many great satisfactions in our work. I have to admit that tonight is one of the absolutely most satisfying moments for me, that Dr. Karlos Hill, a former student of mine, a young man who came from Natchitoches, Louisiana to McAllister in the 1990s, went on to the University of Illinois to get his PhD, turned his dissertation into a book, Beyond the Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory, published by Cambridge University Press. For those of you who don't travel in academic circles, for a young scholar to publish her or his first book with Cambridge University Press is virtually unheard of. Karlos then went out to the provinces and taught at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, and then moved over to Norman, Oklahoma, and the University of Oklahoma, where he is the chairperson of the African American Studies program and a professor of history. In the last year, Karlos has published 2 books, and I'm going to show this off. He's published a graphic text, The Murder of Emmett Till, a great resource to get this history in the hands of young people. And now, most recently, in what he will be presenting tonight, is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And obviously, if you have been following political discourse in the United States in the last year, you know that how to remember the Tulsa Race Massacre, how to remember the aftermath of that massacre in Tulsa, and how to talk about and implement reparations to make up for the consequences of that massacre has been central to the political discourse in the United States as we and others have wrestled with the murder of George Floyd and what that has revealed about how American society has evolved. So I am just thrilled that a young man that I know is playing a major role in this conversation, and that he has made time in his busy schedule to Zoom with us tonight and drop some knowledge with us about Tulsa. Please, if you have questions as you're listening, type them, if you're in Zoom, into the chat. If you're watching on Facebook, into the comment function on Facebook. Robin and Carla and I will try to track those questions and share them with Professor Hill after he completes his presentation. So I'm going to shut up and let the star of the evening have the floor. Professor Hill.
I don't know if I can begin, Peter. I am on cloud 9 right now. I could just not present. You have really lifted my spirit. I am so grateful for your invitation to be here to try to help share with your patrons, the history of the race massacre, not so much from my perspective, but from the perspective of victim survivors and descendants. And so it's a huge honor and a privilege anytime that I can speak those truths, but it's so much more meaningful for me when I can do it, having been invited by one of my mentors. And I think one of the things that people have to understand about the work that we do is that people like me just don't come to being. Right? There are decades of mentorship that go into scholars such as me who get devoted to the community, get sort of really deep into justice work as it relates to the present day implications of the history that we study. We have role models that we end up emulating and hopefully contributing in the ways that they did. And for me, you certainly was one of those people. And I tell people all the time, I went to the University of Illinois because of Peter. I went to graduate school because of Peter, because you cared so much about me. You took the time to help me think through this really important decision of graduate school and all the work that you did with me to get me there. I am so grateful. So it's a tremendous honor for me to be here, based on just this moment in history. As you so eloquently put it, we have been experiencing, some people call it a racial reckoning. I think it's much deeper than that. But we've certainly, our conversations have been centered on how do we deal with this past that will not pass because we refuse to deal with it. And so I want to just share a little bit about that tonight, but I just could not let you introduce me and not let people know how deeply appreciative I'm of you for all you've done for me and have guided me all this time. And so thank you, Peter. as Peter said, I'm Dr. Karlos Hill. I'm an associate professor, Regents professor, and chair of the Clara Luper Department of African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And in many ways, I began my journey as a community engaged scholar at Macalester College, watching the likes of Peter Ratcliffe, watching the likes of Mahmoud El-Khadi, watching the likes of Jim Brewer Stewart, in the ways in which they were concerned not just with the history, but they were concerned with the people impacted by the history. And so for me, that's what it truly means to be a community engaged scholar. And so I, as a historian, I lead with that. Like, that is my entry into the history. It's not about knowing the history, make a contribution to how we understand the history. It's what can we do about the history right now? And so that's what guides my scholarship. And that's certainly what's guiding my scholarship on the Race Massacre. So I'm a community engaged scholar. As much as I can, be a community engaged leader, committed to interrogating these really difficult histories, these really difficult racial histories of violence, trauma, right? And as much as one can, we can deal with the present day implications. And if we can do that, the hope is that we can create a more just, a more equitable world in dealing with those present day realities, implications of racist terror and racial oppression more broadly in these United States. And so what I want to talk to you about tonight, and I'm going to share my screen here if I can. What I want to talk to you tonight about is my research. And I would say, I've been transformed by Tulsa. I don't even talk about the Race Massacre as my research anymore. I talk about it as my work and witness. Because, I was just telling one of the commissioners tonight, we had a end of the commission celebration tonight in Greenwood. So I'm in Greenwood right now as we speak. And I told one of the commissioners, what is the next thing? Like, how are we going to continue this work forward even after the commission sunsets? And so my heart and my mind right now is what the future looks like. How can we continue now that the media has left and we don't know when they might return in the ways that they were here in the last 3 weeks? How does the work continue? How do we continue to build on what we have created over the last 5 years? So that's at the top of my mind right now, is how do we keep pushing on this? And so central to my efforts has been to try to tell the story of what had happened while centering always the stories, the experiences, the recollections of victims, survivors, and their descendants. Because what they tell us is that the Race Massacre, the 1921 Race Massacre, is the deadliest outbreak, not one of, the deadliest outbreak of anti-Black violence in American history. And when I realized that that is what I was engaged in, it was so humbling to try to begin to tell this story in ways that did justice to those victims, to those survivors, as well as to the current day descendants. And so I say that, and I emphasize that because I want to be clear that the Race Massacre really is the darkest chapter in Oklahoma history. The viciousness of the attack and the indifference in terms of the response, I believe, is the darkest chapter in Oklahoma history, and maybe even our nation's history, because the federal government, the U.S. government did little to support survivors in the aftermath, just as the city did very little to support survivors in the aftermath. And so I think this is perhaps the darkest chapter in our nation's history. And so with that, what I want to do with the time I have tonight, and I want to speak for 45, 50 minutes, I want to provide an overview of my book, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, Photographic History. I want to share with you some photographs from that book. And I want to do that with a few objectives in mind. And so I want to share with you those objectives. Obviously, as I mentioned already, I want to discuss with you this history from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants. And the reason why that's important to me is for 100 years, literally for 100 years, the race massacre, and particularly the perspectives of survivors were all but ignored, were all but discredited. Particularly survivor recollections about airplanes dropping incendiaries, or machine guns being fired upon the community, mass graves, survivors seeing bodies of friends, loved ones stacked in piles and ultimately tossed in mass graves. Those are recollections of survivors for 100 years who were ignored, were discredited. That it was said often it was not possible. How could that have been kept secret, hidden? But 100 years later, as I was discussing with Peter before, we had a president of the United States who validated all of those recollections, all of those experiences, all of those memories that for 100 years have been discredited. And so, as I've said in commission meetings and I've said in presentations such as this, the 100th anniversary for me is only meaningful to the extent that we center victims, survivors, and descendants who had been discredited for 100 years. And in centering them, we create a conversation about the justice work, the reparations work that is necessary if we are going to attempt to, not even reconcile, attempt to reconcile the city, the state, and this community 100 years later. And so everything that I will say tonight will be about centering victims, survivors, and their descendants. One of the flashpoints in centering survivors is, how do we talk about this history? And the commission, the Centennial Commission, that sort of played a really big role in how the state as well as the nation commemorated the massacre, shifted how it talked about how it talked about what occurred in 2015, 2016, 2017, and even part of 2018. The commission talked about what occurred as a race riot. 2018, there was a shift, and since then, not only the commission has shifted to the massacre, talking about what occurred as a massacre versus a race riot. The state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, and the world now talks about this history as a massacre. And so I want to explain why that's so important. Why does that phraseology matter so much, especially to the justice work that has been going and needs to continue here in Greenwood. I also want to sort of talk about, in my mind, why it's part of the reason why it's so important to center the story of victims, survivors, and descendants. And what I've said again to folk on the commission and in lectures, we would not be talking about the race massacre 100 years later if survivors had not only rebuilt the community, but the community thrived for decades thereafter. In so many instances, when Black communities were attacked by white mobs, Black communities fled and never returned. And they did it for good reason, because they had no assurance that another attack wouldn't occur in the future. And so the fact that Greenwood not only rebuilt itself, but thrived for decades after is the reason why we are having this conversation about 100 years later, what has occurred 100 years later. What has Tulsa learned? What has Tulsa done? We're only having that because of the resilience and the faith of survivors. And so in centering this history, it's not just about talking about it in a certain way, it's about telling the whole story, not just of what happened to victims, survivors, and descendants, but what they did in response. And if you tell the story of what they did in response, you have to tell that story of a slow rebuild, but then ultimately a renaissance occurring 20 years after the race massacre. And oftentimes, what I have learned in talking to descendants, that's the story that they want told, not what happened to them, but what they did in response. And so in centering victims, survivors, and descendants, we need to talk about rebuilding. And so I want to try to, in the little time that I have, talk about that. And so those are sort of my objectives for today. And so I'm just going to kind of jump right in. And so it's really, 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 really important to understand what Greenwood was before this historic race massacre. And I want to try to give you just enough to understand the gravitas of this community, even the significance of this community, not just to its members, but to Black America circa 1921. And so I want to share with you just three sort of basic sort of points about Greenwood. And so in 1921, there were nearly 11,000, but some estimates, a little bit more than 11,000 Black people who called the Greenwood district home, or North Tulsa home in 1921. And not only was there 11,000 Black Americans living in the Greenwood district of North Tulsa in 1921, and making it, in the state of Oklahoma, one of the largest, if not the largest, Black community in the state. 7 years or 8 years prior to the race massacre, Booker T. Washington visited Oklahoma. He did not visit Greenwood, but he visited Oklahoma. He was on a tour of all Black towns of Oklahoma. But that did not stop him from remarking about the Greenwood district and the sort of for 1913, how impressive this community was and what it had accomplished in such a short period of time. And so in 1913, upon visiting Oklahoma, visiting all Black towns, he commented that for him, Tulsa represented a Negro Wall Street of America. And, in 1913, they're not really good estimates, but there were probably somewhere between 75 and 100 businesses in the Greenwood district already. And so the community, but in 1900, right, at the turn of the century, there was one business, and there may have been none at all at the turn of the century. Because O.W. Gurley, and I'll talk about him a little bit, in 1905, 1906, really is the visionary of Greenwood that buys some of the initial property in the area, and then begins to build his own businesses, and then sell the land that he's purchased to other Black migrants who find their way to Tulsa's Greenwood district. But to sort of make this point more emphatically, Booker T. Washington saw in O.W. Gurley and some of the early sort of Black migrants to Oklahoma, especially to Tulsa, this entrepreneurial spirit, this collective spirit, and that spirit of business ownership, in creating opportunities for economic independence for Black people. He saw in Tulsa a symbol of what was possible even in segregated America. Because admittedly, Booker T. Washington is trying to convince Black Americans that casting down their buckets where they are is the best possible path toward not just social and political equality, but economic advancement. And so he saw in Greenwood his vision for what was possible for Black Americans. And so the race massacre in many ways was a repudiation of that vision, of Booker T. Washington's hope for what was possible in Black America and for Black Americans. But nonetheless, he spoke into existence a phrase, the Negro Wall Street, now referred to as the Black Wall Street of America, that has stuck and has become an enduring kind of symbol of not only Greenwood, but Black America. And so we need to understand that, when we talk about Tulsa, it's deeply connected with the strivings of, it's deeply connected with, in the early 20th century, the possibilities of the economic possibilities for Black Americans at that time. And so when we think about the Greenwood District circa 1921, the Greenwood District was again home to nearly 11,000 Black people, and it spanned a 35 block area. And it was home to one of the wealthiest Black communities in America. And some would say perhaps the wealthiest Black community per capita at the time. And so what we have to understand about the Greenwood District is circa 1921, there were probably 4 millionaires, Black millionaires in the Greenwood District. In today's dollars, there were probably a half a dozen near millionaires in the Greenwood District in circa 1921. There have been some recent estimates of the community's wealth, if we were trying to represent the wealth of the community today, in today's dollars, circa 1921, what would it be? And there are some estimates that say if you put the Greenwood District circa 1921 on the open market today, it would be worth $600 million in terms of the property and businesses. And so, when we talk about the Greenwood District, we have to really talk about a true a success story in the truest sense, because in 1900 there were no Black millionaires and very few Black people in the Greenwood District or the area that occupies the Greenwood District. 20 years later, there are 4 millionaires in today's dollars and at least a half dozen near millionaires. And so this was an amazing transformation. And so Booker T. Washington was trying to help Black Americans and even white Americans at that time to understand the ways in which a Black community could prosper if it was allowed to do so. And this is why the race massacre is so tragic. The question that I have been asked repeatedly in the last several weeks is, what would Greenwood have been had it not been destroyed by a mob in 1921? And that's a question that none of us can answer, but certainly Greenwood, the Greenwood that is here today, what is left of the Greenwood District today, I think we would see many more of those historic businesses like the Dreamland Theater or the Gurley Hotel. I imagine that those really smart, really resilient Black business owners would have grown, right, those impressive businesses for 1921 into great businesses, American businesses that are known not just in Greenwood, but around this country, and maybe even around the world. And so when we talk about the Greenwood District, we have to understand that we will never know what Greenwood would have been had it been left untouched. But I think it begs a different question today. The question is, what would Greenwood be today if the city of Tulsa provided the reparations, right? That certainly the living survivors deserve, but I believe the community deserves, because the community was attacked, not just the survivors, the community was attacked. And so if the community was attacked, and in attacking that community, there was a liquidation of Black wealth to the tune perhaps of $600 million in today's dollars. If the race massacre was also a liquidation of Black wealth, then 100 years later, there can be a historic investment in the community. And so in so many ways, that is what I've been fighting for, what members of the community have been fighting for, is what can the city of Tulsa do today? They didn't do it in 1921, but what can it do today to make whole a community that it destroyed and was indifferent to thereafter? And so, in sort of helping you to try to understand not just what was, but what Greenwood represented 1921, I want to just talk a little bit, spend a few minutes, and this is probably my least part of talking about the history, because it has in many ways little to do with victim, survivor, and descendants, but it's really important for us to be grounded in what transpired that led to this most deadly attack on a Black community in American history. And so I want to just spend just a few moments on just some basic context that I know many of you probably understand because of all of the documentaries that have occurred in the last, there's at least been a half dozen documentaries, major documentaries that have occurred on the race massacre in the last 2 weeks they've been released. And so some of this context is probably fresh, but I'll just share it anyway. The race massacre, as so many lynchings, as so many other Black attacks on Black communities, was precipitated by an allegation of assault, sexual assault. And so during the evening hours of May 31st, and the early morning hours of June 1st, Tulsa exploded because of rumors, right, that ultimately get validated in the Tulsa Tribune, but rumors initially that a Black man, a young Black man by the name of Dick Rowland, 19 years of age, we believe, had sexually assaulted. Whites used the word raped. A young white girl, 17-year-old white girl, Sarah Page. And as rumors of this attempted sexual assault began to spread across Tulsa, a white mob begins to gather downtown Tulsa, murmuring about lynching. And as these rumors and murmurs about lynching occur, there are two newspaper reports. First, a newspaper report, and then second, an editorial later that evening. But on the afternoon of May 31st, there is a news report about 3 p.m. that essentially all but says that Dick Rowland did assault Sarah Page and insinuate that he will be lynched. Later that evening, there is an editorial in the Tribune that the headline for the editorial is "To Lynch a Negro Tonight." This was, for all intents and purposes, a call for whites, white men, white boys, white women and girls to come downtown to witness the lynching of Dick Rowland in vengeance for this attack, this alleged attack on Sarah Page. And so by the evening hours, dozens and then ultimately hundreds of whites have gathered around the county courthouse, threatening to remove Dick Rowland, to break into the jail and remove Dick Rowland if he's not released into their custody. And so as nightfall comes and the crowd grows and the murmurs go to threats, the Black community is increasingly concerned that Dick Rowland will in fact be lynched. And in the tradition of collective armed self-defense, in the tradition of collective armed self-defense, Black men go downtown to offer assistance to police authorities because they worry if they do not intervene, if they do not put their body between the mob and the jail, the mob and Dick Rowland, that Dick Rowland will be lynched. Because just the year before the massacre, a white man in Tulsa is lynched. And so it's crystal clear for the Black community, especially the two groups of Black men that go downtown, that if they don't intervene, if they don't try to show that there will be resistance to removing Dick Rowland from the jail, that this young Black man will be lynched. And so in that spirit, they go downtown armed, offering assistance to the Tulsa authorities. And in both instances, they are told, no, we do not need your help. And in the second instance, when a second group, a larger group in the second time, we think about 75 Black men went downtown armed the second time because the threat of the lynching became even more alarming. In the second moment where they go downtown and they're told no, and as they're leaving, a white man, one white man in this sea of whites, hundreds of whites who are downtown, attempts to disarm one of the Black veterans who had proudly fought in World War I, tried to take his weapon. And in the struggle that ensued over that weapon, a shot is fired, strikes a white bystander. Many think he's immediately killed by that gunshot. And proverbially, at that moment, all hell breaks loose, and Black men who are armed are being fired upon by white men who think that they shot that fatal bullet that killed that white bystander. So they return fire, and ultimately in the melee, in this exchange of gunfire, nearly 20 Black as well as white Tulsans die initially. And so that firefight spreads, grows in the ensuing hours. And it doesn't grow organically. In many ways, it's aided and abetted by white Tulsan authorities. What occurs in the moments after shots are fired between Black men and white men downtown, Black men who have come downtown to offer assistance and to offer a show of support for Dick Rowland, they ultimately are forced to flee for their lives, and they're forced to try to, as best they can, make their way back to the Greenwood district. And so in the ensuing hours, Black men form a barricade around or near the dividing line between Black Tulsa and white Tulsa, which was called the Frisco tracks or the San Francisco Railroad tracks in Tulsa that divided, again, white Tulsa and Black Tulsa. And so Black men fleeing downtown, but also recognizing they were being chased by members of the mob, form a defensive wall at the San Francisco Railroad and hold off during the late evening and early morning hours, attempts by members of that same mob that had been downtown to invade the Greenwood district. Ultimately, because of the ways in which the city of Tulsa, particularly the police, weaponized the mob, began to deputize whites who were calling for the lynching of Dick Rowland. Those same men are deputized, given the power by the Tulsa police to detain and kill right? Black people who they were arguing at the time, or were asserting at the time, were in rebellion against white Tulsans. And so at 5 a.m., at least, about 8 hours, 7 to 8 hours after the initial gunfire, the gunshot being fired, a mob of whites arrayed themselves on the boundaries of the Greenwood district. And we think in 3 particular areas. And at 5 a.m., when a siren was sounded, that group, right, and Scott Ellsworth, what I call the sort of the premier historian of the race massacre, has estimated as many as 10,000 whites could have arrayed themselves on the borders of the Greenwood district. And when that, at 5 a.m., that siren sounded, in unison, those whites invaded the Greenwood district and systematically began to burn, loot, and ultimately destroy a 35-block area. And we estimate, we do not know, but we estimate based on American Red Cross records that as many as 300 people, Black people, died because of this torrent, this rampage of violence. And so, in a nutshell, in less than 24 hours, a community, a 35-block area community with 11,000 Black people and one of the wealthiest Black communities in the country was destroyed, was gone in less than 24 hours. And so for me, this is what makes the massacre not a exceptional event, because Black communities were attacked throughout this period, but the speed and rapidity by which this community was destroyed and the viciousness that was unleashed upon this community in that time period, in that short amount of time, I think is unprecedented in American history, and certainly for the era. Just the thoroughness of the violence and the destruction has left me still scratching my head by how did this happen? I still have as many questions as I have answers about how this actually happened, how this community was so devastated in such a short period of time. And so part of my witness as it relates to this history has been to interrogate its photographic legacy. And so I want to try to turn to that if I can. But before I turn to that photographic legacy, I just want to also talk about perhaps the most important cultural product that has educated the world about the race massacre, and that would be the Watchman. The Watchman has had such an impact, not just on popular culture, it's had an impact on me and how I tell this story. And I share with you I want to talk about the Watchman because in many ways I began my work with the race massacre in a context where the Watchman series was not on the horizon. And so part of what I was trying to do in 2016, 2017 is to try to imagine how can I, as a historian that doesn't have the resources of Hollywood, how can I convince people that this was a massacre? How can I powerfully convey this argument with words? Ultimately, what I've understood is that images, moving images, are so much more powerful than words in conveying history. And it's certainly helping that history resonate with people. And so what the Watchman did circa October 2019 and thereafter when it was released was to really capture the viciousness and the brutality of what occurred in those hours. And, having studied the Watchman, particularly that first episode, that first 10 minutes of the episode that depicts the massacre, and sort of watching it over and over and over and over, I've gained a deep appreciation for Damon Lindelof, the showrunner and creator of the Watchman. I've had the great opportunity to talk to Damon about the film and to praise him for how he centered victims, survivors, and descendants. You cannot watch that 10-minute clip and not be moved. And it's because of the ways in which they stitch into the storytelling and into the telling survivor accounts in subtle ways and in some not so subtle ways. That 10-minute clip did more to advance the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants than 100 years worth of activism. And so in so many ways, we are talking about the race massacre as a massacre because of the ways in which the Watchman series sort of brought it to life. And then at the same time, the Watchman has really helped us to understand and validate some of the most polarizing legacies of the massacre, such as the use of machine guns, the ways in which machine guns were turned on the community, the ways in which airplanes were used to hasten the destruction of the Greenwood district. One of the things that my dear brother, Pastor Turner, has talked about is who's the pastor of Vernon AME Church, the only surviving structure today from the Black Wall Street era, just down the street in Greenwood. That pastor, Pastor Turner, has talked about and has made his witness talking about how Greenwood is the first American activity to be bombed and what that means for this community. His activism has really revolved around that. And so I've learned tremendously from him. But again, the Watchman, the ways in which it depicts it, the ways in which it validates the memories of survivors, and the ways in which now a whole generation of Americans and then people around the world, that has become central to their understanding in ways that has been central to survivors' understanding for 100 years, but have been ignored. And so I'm in deep debt to Damon for his work, because he did the work that I hoped my book could do. And I think does it differently. But certainly I was thinking along the lines of how can we visually arrest people so that they are not the same after having watched the film and having sort of seen some of the images connected to this history. How can we tell it in such a way that people will not only be moved, but they will care. And because they care, they live in the world differently. And they're willing to do things connected to this history that they wouldn't be willing to do, because they now know what survivors truly experienced as a result of this massacre. And so that's the context in which I created this book, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It's not a book that I ever thought I would write. It's a book that because of the work that I was doing connected to the commission, I felt I needed to write. And so this is work deeply connected to the work and how I could create a book that could bear witness to victims, survivors, and descendants in the interest of reparations, but also to do what hadn't been done for so many years, which is tell the story from their vantage point, use their voices, their experiences, centering them, right, was my goal. And so that was challenging because I understood that if I was going to tell this history in ways that people would connect with it, that ways in which people would be moved and maybe even care, I was probably going to have to use the more than 500 images of the race massacre that I discovered, let alone identified, but I discovered in doing this work with the commission beginning in 2016 and 2017. And what I discovered is, I think, something that I really, in future years really want to explore more deeply. But one of the things that just occurred to me in just, really diving into the photographic legacy of the massacre is that perhaps, and I really believe this, I can't prove it, but I believe that the race massacre is likely the most photographed instance of anti-Black violence in American history, especially in the post-slavery era. I think it's perhaps the most photographed instance because there's just, literally hundreds of images of what occurred, particularly on June 1st in the days following it. And my big challenge in the book was what images can both help people to understand what occurred and at the same time help us to understand this history from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants. Now, what makes this complicated is the images were created for white consumption, right? The images were created for, by whites who were spectators or even participants in the race massacre. And they were created for whites who weren't there, who couldn't be there, as kind of keepsakes, as kind of mementos for what occurred. The goal of creating photographs was to document that whites had successfully suppressed a quote unquote Negro rebellion. And so my challenge was understanding that I would most powerfully convey what occurred through the images, but understanding that these images weren't created with survivors in mind. It was actually the antithesis. And so trying to harness these images that were used to perpetuate the white supremacist vision of what occurred, using those images to tell a different story, a more powerful story of how, what Black Americans, what Black Tulsans, what Black survivors experienced, and how they found a courage and a faith and resilience that I am still trying to wrap my mind around to rebuild the community. And so my goal was to try to force, in many ways, these images, the images that are in the book, to tell that story. And to the extent that the book is successful, it disrupts that white supremacist vision of what occurred, narrative of what occurred, and replaces it with the story of survivors. And I tried to accomplish that by the ways in which the photos are captioned. I tried to accomplish that by having alongside many of the photographs survivor accounts that could actively disrupt the white supremacist gaze that created those very images. And so, the goal was to create something that could move people, to help people to understand that what occurred was no race riot, as President Biden said when he gave an address in Greenwood on June 1, on the anniversary. It was a massacre. And the reason why this phraseology is so important for me is if we're going to center the history from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants, it's important to use the word massacre. From the beginning, survivors talked about what occurred as a massacre. They also talked about it as a riot, but they talked about it as a massacre, as a disaster. And so if we're going to center this history, it's important to use the phraseology that survivors used. And so that's what I've tried to do. Also, it was important because survivors have long contended that one of the reasons why the city talked about it as a race riot was to deprive them of restitution for the losses that they suffered. There were riot clauses, particularly in many of the insurance companies at the time, but certainly in the insurance companies that populated Tulsa, that by the city referring to it as a riot, and ultimately those insurance companies deeming it a riot, it shielded them from having to pay restitution. And so massacre, talking about it as a massacre, talking about it as a disaster, a man-made disaster, was strategic, in the aftermath of the massacre, because it was about trying to fight the city and to fight insurance companies in paying restitution for the damages and the losses suffered during this most deadly attack on a Black community in American history. And so my goal was in a moment where the Watchman was not on the horizon, and we couldn't imagine such a great cinematic depiction of this from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants, in 2016, 2017, the book was created to do that work. And so I see it as sort of resting alongside the work that the Watchman does. It's not just about telling the story, it's about stirring people, unsettling people, so that they come to terms of what actually happened. They are confronted with visual imagery of what happened. And the hope is, in being confronted with this history, they learn it in a new way, and they care about it in ways that they perhaps did not. And that then they are now a different person in the world, and they perhaps will behave differently in the world because they understand this history different. That was my theory of change in sort of writing this book and spending the last, certainly the last 5 years, stressing about writing and publishing this book. And so what I want to do as I kind of close is just share with you some of the most compelling images from the book that I hope tells the story from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants. And as you are, as these photographs cascade across your screen, I want you to be thinking about survivors. I want you to be thinking about what it would have meant for them to have witnessed the creation, the birth of Black Wall Street in the 19-teens. In the 1921, see it all but burned to the ground. And then nonetheless, as the image here on the cover of the book suggests, nonetheless, days after, they began to literally pick up the pieces and rebuild, so that by 1925, much of the Greenwood district had been rebuilt. And by 1940, there were more businesses in the Greenwood district than there had been in 1921. There are more people in the Greenwood district, more Black people in the Greenwood district in 1940 than there had been in 1921. I want you to think about these images from the vantage point of survivors. And so with that, I'm going to just share with you a handful of images, and I'm going to purposefully kind of go through them very slowly because I want you to study them as much as you can. I will say that all of these images are disturbing. All of these images, in many ways, have stirred me to tears. And so I don't share them with you lightly, but again, part of what this book is about is confronting the photographic legacy. And so I want to just share with you a few of those images. And so I won't provide any commentary over the images that I share. I just want you to kind of take in them. And so I will share those images, and as I share them, I will turn off my camera. So thank you for very slowly and patiently being attentive to the images that I just shared. I can say for sure that I have been transformed by this history and especially the images. I thought I knew what occurred, during the race massacre prior to coming to Oklahoma. I had no idea until I began to be in relationship with the community of descendants, and certainly, understanding this history through those photographs. What the photographs really depict, I have argued, is at minimum a massacre. I think it may be productive to talk about this as a community lynching, because make no mistake about it, every significant structure in the Greenwood district, save maybe one, was either destroyed or severely damaged. We oftentimes talk about Black churches being bombed. There were 13 Black churches in Greenwood. None of them were standing, save for Vernon AME's outer walls. This was a community lynching. And when I say that, I mean that the goal was not just to punish the community. The goal was to terrorize the community in such a fashion that they would leave Tulsa and never return. This was an attempted expulsion of Tulsa's Black community that failed because survivors refused to leave. It failed because of their deep belief in what Greenwood represented. And so, so much of me, and I'm starting to tear up here, because so much of this work I've been transformed by, because doing the history of lynching and racial violence is one thing, but when you begin to work for those who have been impacted by this history means so much more. And you understand the impact that work can do to elevate, to support, these struggles. And so I have been completely transformed by this community's history, this community's story, as well as being in service to them. And so, this is not, and I'll just end by saying this is not just a history of tragedy. This is a story of how Black survivors had the faith, the courage, the resilience to believe Greenwood was worth fighting for, and set about in the moments, in the days after the massacre, to rebuild this community. And because of their faith, because of their vision, because of their determination, because of their grit, we have been able to commemorate 100 years of history after the massacre. And so much of my transformation has been to understand just how powerful the survivors have been in terms of telling this story, creating opportunities for me to tell this story so many years later, with the hope that even 100 years later, there is justice, there is accountability that can occur. Because while most of the principles and participants in this history have long gone, the institutions that aided and abetted, the police, the fire department, the mayor's office, the city council, Tulsa leadership, right? Those institutions are still here. They're still with us. There is accountability that can be had as it relates to those institutions if we have the courage to demand it and see that justice, not just justice in general, but justice centered on victims, survivors, and descendants, if we demand it. And so much of my work, so much of my witness in the last 5 years and into the future will be continuing to bear witness to their stories and to the justice that has to happen for those living survivors and the community. And so with that, I will pause for the great questions that I know are coming. And again, I'm just so grateful that you've created an opportunity to share with you sort of my work and witness on the Race Massacre.
Dr. Karlos Hill, thank you so much. We do have some questions from our friend Earl Ross. These images are disturbing, and yet they seem so necessary to how we remember this event. How have these images been used in the arguments for reparations? And Earl adds, as someone who lived in Philadelphia when a bomb was dropped on Osage Avenue, the MOVE event in Philly in the 1980s has often been compared to the Tulsa Massacre. I struggle with this comparison, but I understand how folks make it. As an historian, what do you think about such comparisons?
I mean, I will try to work my way to that part of the question. I'll try to start with the first part where the question was around how are these images, if at all, being used to mark in an argument around reparations. I don't think these photographs, although they appear in documentaries, although they appear in news coverage as kind of illustrations of what occurred, I don't think they have seriously been taken up currently in a real vigorous discussion around reparations, at the city level or at the state level. These photographs, many of them have only recently come to light. I mean, Scott Ellsworth, who were referred to as the premier historian of the Race Massacre, when he wrote his first book in the 1970s, there were very few images of the massacre. The whites who had these images were not sharing them. Fast forward 2 to 3 decades later, there are hundreds of photographs that have been donated by survivors, by eyewitnesses, and then by those who, through means that are not always clear, had possession of these photographs but donated them to either the Tulsa Historical Society, the Oklahoma Historical Society, and Greenwood Cultural Center, to just name a few of the kind of organizations that have repositories for these images. And so I don't think that these images have been marshaled in a conversation on reparations, but certainly my goal was to do just that and to try to make the case as compelling as possible for the destruction, for the loss of life, but also to try to tell the story of how the community rebuilt, to raise that question that I raised. We know what Greenwood became 20 years later because of the strivings of the community, the grit of the community. What could the community have been 20 years later had the city actually helped it rebuild? We know for the time period that was just always off the table, but it's a question that we raise not because of a what if 100 years ago. It's a what now? What if the city now had made a historic investment into the Greenwood district that it helped to destroy and was indifferent to rebuilding? That's a question for today. And so my hope is that these photographs keep that question in the forefront. In terms of comparisons, I am not, I'm okay with them because, the race massacre is eerily representative of the Black experience. It's just the scale and the scope and the thoroughness of the destruction of this community, the rapidity of it. But it was part and parcel of the Black experience. There are a number of projects today that's trying to capture, there's the Equal Justice Initiative, there's some grassroots efforts that's trying to really understand the scope and the scale of terrorist violence such as the Tulsa Race Massacre. And based on the work that has occurred, beginning in the mid-19th century, all the way through to the 1950s, there are estimates that as many as 250 Black communities experienced a similar fate as Tulsa. Not completely destroyed, right? But that level of violence, Black communities were attacked. And so this is a part of the Black experience. This is a core part of the Black experience. And so for me, I'm okay with those comparisons because what people are trying to grapple with this history, try to make sense of it, and using the race massacre to do so. So I'm okay with that. But at the same time, I know that, the comparisons have to always be in context, and we have to always sort of recognize that although racial violence has, in terms of the Black experience, has been constant throughout the experience, and and that what we see in the race massacre is lynching culture. What we see in the race massacre is what we've seen in so many communities, occurred in Black America. I mean, for God's sakes, the Red Summer of 1919, where more than 24, right, Black communities are attacked in a similar fashion as what occurred in Tulsa. We know that this is a part of the experience, but Tulsa, from my vantage point, is singular in terms of the scope and the scale, as well as the significance of the community, right? This was, referred to by the most powerful Black man in American history, at the time, and maybe in American history, Booker T. Washington, that this was the Negro Wall Street of America. So the viciousness of the attack, the scope and scale of it happening to this community is what makes it unprecedented. A community like Greenwood is what's unprecedented. So for so many reasons, I've just had to tell this story.
Thank you. I want to jump in and pick up a couple of threads from the questions and also add something of my own.
Yes.
We're in a moment now in the United States where, on the one hand, this changing the narrative, this new perspective, and on the other hand, this pushback in the form of prohibiting so-called critical race theory. And I was in a conversation today where someone said, well, we don't want to just hear about victims, and that critical race theory is just going to be about victims. And I think of your first book, Beyond the Rope, and your work in this project on Tulsa. And how would you talk about what African Americans did with what was done to them?
Yeah, in Beyond the Rope, that book is devoted to talking about not what happened to Black people in terms of racist, terrorist violence, lynching, but how Black people responded to what happened to them, the stories that they told about what happened to them in the interest of mobilizing Black communities as well as educating future generations. So the book was really about trying to understand that slice of Black experience of lynching. And so I coined the phrase in the book, consoling narratives of the lynched Black body. And that's a sort of, I deem it kind of a genre of lynching narratives in which, Black survivors, but also, journalists like Ida B. Wells attempted to transform narratives, lynching narratives of the sort of destruction of lynched Black bodies and the mastery of lynched Black bodies into stories of hope, into stories of resistance. And so in so many ways, I see in the recollections of survivors, in the spirit of descendants, consoling narratives of the lynched Black bodies, right? This tradition of storytelling that was about positioning the community to move beyond the tragedy, the pain, the suffering, the trauma, and to utilize those stories as means of mobilizing the community, putting those stories to work, essentially, in the interest of activism, justice, et cetera. And so much of that book is about trying to tell that story. And in so many ways, I saw that, I've seen that on display for the last 5 years, and certainly during the centennial. And so I think it's about, the big point of the book is, to explain that Black Americans have not only related to the lynching or histories of racial violence through the lens of terror, right? There have been these other ways in which these stories, these narratives have been put to work. And so part of it is the kind of movement work that occurred in transforming how Americans understood lynching. The NAACP that's featured in the book was central to changing the narrative from lynchings to being about Black beast rapists to lynch victims being victims, like actual victims, like the idea that Black people could be victims. That was something that the NAACP in their 50 years anti-lynching campaign was about. That was successful, even though an anti-lynching bill never occurred. And so there is this deep tradition of consoling narratives of the lynched Black body that I have seen on display here in Tulsa, and certainly in the narratives that survivors have told. I mean, if anybody was able to witness Mother Randall and Mother Fletcher and Hugh Van Ellis go before Congress and tell and speak their truth about what they saw, what they felt, and how 100 years later, right, this history lives in their bones. They wake up with it, they go to bed with it. The ways in which they crafted this, I believe, a consoling narrative of the lynched Black body before us all was really powerful. And so I've tried to, in that tradition, put the images to work and try to put those survivor accounts to work to tell that larger, deeper story. And so I hope that answers your question, the first part of your question, Peter. And then just to speak to the other part in terms of the current efforts in Oklahoma, during the centennial year, to make difficult teaching of the race massacre and other histories of racism in Oklahoma and the rest of the country. Part of what that is about is who gets to tell this story, who gets to not only tell the story of the race massacre, but Oklahoma history. And, centering massacre is something that makes people in Oklahoma really uncomfortable. I can't tell you how many letters I've gotten from whites at the University of Oklahoma writing me directly, just outraged that I would have the audacity to talk about this as a massacre when white people died as well, and Black people had guns too, and they weren't the only ones shooting. This was a race war. And for them, this is revisionist history at its finest. For them, this is the true whitewashing of the history. And, you know, I never respond to these, you know, and I get them often, just some last week. You know, this is about who gets to tell the story, right? Because they fundamentally believe that the only thing that these histories accomplish is to tell a story in which white people come out as racists and Black people come out as victims who deserve reparations. And if we told the real story of this history, we would tell the ways in which white people were victims as well. They died. We never focus on them. I mean, the rabbit holes that these individuals go down are frightening. But, you know, for me, I've always understood, and the reason why I'm so adamant about centering victims, survivors, and descendants is this is where the real power is in telling the story. And I think there are many individuals that understand that and understand that in centering and telling the story in a certain way, it creates certain expectations and even perhaps realities for how we deal with this history moving forward. And so the battle lines have become very clear. We do not want the 1619 Project in school. We do not want to teach the Tulsa Race Massacre as a massacre in schools because of the ways in which it will force us to be different in the world. We have to have different ways in which we deal with people of color in schools. We have to have a different way in which we deal with the Greenwood district, how the Greenwood district, one of the wealthiest communities, Black communities in this country today. You know, a conservative estimate of poverty in North Tulsa, the Greenwood district, is about 35% of all Black residents live in poverty. And, you know, I mean, I could tell you all kinds of things about how the Greenwood of today is different from the Greenwood of 1921 or even 1941 or even 1961 before urban removal that I know I know certainly you, Peter, understand in terms of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul and how, you know, an interstate highway, you know, destroyed that community. The same thing happened in Tulsa. Right. Same thing. And for many, you know, activists in the community, they see that as completing the work that the massacre intended to do. And so there's so much at stake in who gets to tell the story, whose stories, whose voices get centered, and what we are seeing, what we are witnessing. I wouldn't say a historic backlash, because this has happened many occasions, but it's happening at a moment, right, where we are truly beginning to have a conversation about this history from the vantage point of people of color. And so at that very moment where a 1619 project becomes a Pulitzer Prize winning history, and even in Oklahoma, I was so surprised, even in Oklahoma, there were hundreds of 1619 leaflets being shared, like handheld, being shared in schools, right? And the race massacre over the last 5 years, we have introduced this history to teachers, right, around the state in some really high, just some really high impact ways that has transformed how this history is being taught. I've been a part of, I've seen that because I've worked with those teachers. And now we're in a moment where all of that is in jeopardy, because even though they can't stop teachers per se from talking about this as a massacre, they can punish them on the back end. And with a law like the one we have written here in Oklahoma, HB 17 or HR 1775, a teacher can be fired immediately without any due process if their principal, if their superintendent deems them teaching critical race theory.
Wow.
And so we are in some really desperate times. And so, I'm, going to continue to teach the Institute. I have an Institute scheduled with Tulsa Public Schools, next week. And then in July, we're continuing to do the work, but we realize that we're doing it in a context in which the very teachers that we're trying to help can be fired for doing this work authentically. And so it's not clear to me how this is actually going to play out. Mm-hmm. But certainly it's made the work more difficult. And I think many teachers are thinking twice in this context about how they teach it, what they say about it. And maybe that will muddle the perspective, right, that would have come forth because of this fear, this terror that they feel stepping into the classroom.
Well, I am just so thankful that you are in the battle, and that if any of us doubt the power of telling the story and centering the experiences of the victims, the survivors, the descendants, you have convinced, I am sure, all of us tonight. And I'm just so proud to know you and thankful that you're in the battle. So I'm going to wrap up the public part of this. On top of everything else you do, you gave us an hour and a half of passion and focus, and showed us what a teacher is. And Carla, you want to restore everybody? Let's make ourselves visible if you want. Unmute yourselves. We're going to shut off the video so you're not on the record, and the state of Oklahoma won't know you were talking about critical race theory. And we can take a few minutes and build community tonight with Dr. Hill.
Absolutely.
So thank you.